With the moving truck behind her, my mother-in-law, Jane, said triumphantly, "I won't be giving out our address to the stranger." Behind her, my husband, Brian, was getting into the car, smirking all the while. It seems he is seriously considering following his parents. I quietly bit my lip. This is typical behavior for them. Assuming I won't retaliate, they do as they please. Although my father-in-law is a decent man, his outdated belief that women should be obedient and supported by their husbands means he's no help. But I've reached my breaking point. After enduring and bottling up so much, like water in a cup, today was the last drop. And today was the final drop. Then, I'll divorce my kept man husband. At that, my in-laws laughed in unison. Talk in your sleep, stupid. They don't know yet. They're unaware that Brian relies on me financially, and even the little income he does make is thanks to me. Nor do they realize that everyone has their breaking point, including me. My name is Olivia, and I'm exactly 50 years old. I work at a local supermarket owned by my brother. It was originally our parents' business, but my brother took over after our father became ill past the age of 60. What started as a family business is now a beloved store in our community. Although it's a store, it operates as a company, and I hold a position there. When my parents were working, my father was the CEO, and my mother was the executive vice president. However, since my brother's wife was a school teacher and couldn't work for us, I became the executive vice president when my brother took over. Currently, I live with just my husband, Brian. I have a daughter who's married and visits us a few times a year. However, she lives in a distant state, so we don't see each other often. Brian and I were high school classmates. Back then, we were just classmates. Being shy, I hardly had any male friends, let alone a boyfriend, and spent most of my time with female friends. In contrast, popular Brian was always surrounded by a lively group of friends, both male and female. When we grew up, he and I reconnected, hit it off, and got married. "I like quiet and demure women like you, Olivia," he said with a shy smile. As we vowed to spend our future together. It was only after everything was too late that I realized this choice was a mistake. What started immediately after our marriage was relentless snide remarks from Jane. "Quit your job and devote yourself to Brian. And hurry up and have children, or you're worthless as a wife." Those were the first words I was greeted with. At that time, I was just an employee at the supermarket. Since Brian was still working normally, it was somewhat understandable that my old-fashioned mother-in-law couldn't grasp my job. But to be deemed worthless without children seemed excessive to me. Even after having a child, Jane didn't change. I had a daughter. Then, Jane arrogantly said, "A girl, how disappointing. You need to have a boy quickly, I have 2 sons." To me, my daughter was irreplaceable and precious, but to Jane, she was just a girl. Although Brian loved our daughter, he never stood up to his mother when we visited his parents' house. In fact, he would join in mocking me. "She can't seem to have another child. And her cooking is terrible, nothing like yours, Mom," he'd say. Then, Jane would clap her hands in delight and laugh. When she was in a good mood, she gave Brian some pocket money, and he was delighted to buy alcohol and sleazy magazines with it. "It would be nice if you took my side for once. And it's just sad for our daughter to see this." When I voiced my complaints upon returning home, he sighed as if he was bothered by the conversation. "She's just a baby, she won't understand, and you're worrying too much. Just keep Mom happy, and it'll all be fine. Be patient." Though it was indeed hard, it was true that these interactions only occurred during visits to the in-laws. I wondered if I should just accept that by enduring, everything would smoothly resolve itself. While my feelings of frustration never faded, I continued to endure relentlessly. However, the situation took a turn for the worse. Previously, we only met Jane when we visited her, but now she started coming to our house on her own initiative. The catalyst for this change was Brian's unemployment. His company fell into poor performance and eventually went bankrupt. Naturally, with no job, he had no income apart from unemployment benefits. And those benefits were only temporary and wouldn't last long. Obviously, we couldn't live like this. So, I accepted a full-time position with a title that my brother had recommended to me, and I started working seriously. Our household finances now depended on my income. To help my son. With this noble cause, Jane eagerly made her way into our home. The father-in-law, George, seemed bemused by her overprotectiveness, but she didn't care about his opinions. Her behavior was quite extreme. It seemed like everything I did displeased her. I was shocked and scared when she started refolding the laundry I had already folded, taking them out of the dresser just to do so. I couldn't understand what drove her to such extremes. If she disliked it so much, I thought, she didn't need to come to a house where I was present. When will you quit your job, Olivia? It's because of you that Brian can't find work. Jane began to make absurd demands of me, who was single-handedly supporting the family. Looking to Brian for a rebuttal, he awkwardly averted his gaze. It wasn't my fault that he couldn't find work. He had no qualifications and his experience was limited to clerical work, with no special skills. Yet, he was picky about his jobs, insisting, "I won't do anything but office work, physical labor is out of the question, and I can't work late." In other words, it was his own fault he couldn't find a job. But in Jane's eyes, my working was the cause of his lack of motivation and the root of all problems. The situation with our child was the same as ever. "Granny's here," she'd say. Despite such words, she openly stated that girls were of less value than boys. When our daughter, who had begun to understand things, started avoiding her grandmother who made nothing but derogatory remarks, Jane snapped. "You're just like your mother. Not cute at all." My daughter was hurt, but Brian did nothing but lie in front of the TV. "There's no need to talk like that. If you dislike me and our daughter so much, you don't have to come over." When I couldn't contain my frustration and spoke out, Jane arrogantly replied, "This is my son's house, so it's none of your business. If you have a problem, you can leave." To reiterate, Brian was unemployed. I was the one supporting the family. I was infuriated by Jane's refusal to face reality. Every time I saw Brian just lying around, ignoring everything, it broke my heart. I reported this to George, and it seems he, who adored his granddaughter, scolded Jane. After that, she stopped making comments about our daughter and her visits were halved. Years later, Brian settled into a life without work, fully becoming a dependent. On the other hand, I, from a housewife's perspective, started contributing to the supermarket's sales with new ideas and became more dedicated to my work. When there was a part-time job opening at the supermarket, I suggested to Brian, "It's easy work, why don't you give it a try?" As a result, he managed to get a job, albeit only working twice a week. During a summer visit to my in-laws, he proudly talked about his new job. Despite it not being his own effort, I thought it was better than nothing and watched over him warmly. "You've finally found a job, Brian. You're truly commendable. Work hard and prove your wife wrong, and make her quit her job soon. A housewife's place is in the home, after all." Jane said this loudly enough for me to hear, addressing him. Moreover, during visits to the cemetery, she would start badmouthing me to acquaintances and neighbors we encountered. "Olivia is such a miser, working for pocket money at her parents' company, truly embarrassing. She neglects her household duties. Making my son suffer." I was constantly ridiculed by her in public. "It's disgraceful, stop it." The only one who seemed fed up enough to speak out was George. My sadness only grew as Brian pretended not to notice. I continued to endure through it all. If only Jane would stay away, Brian, despite being lazy, was a kind father. I kept enduring for the sake of our daughter, believing it was better for her to have her father around until she was independent. Even when I no longer needed to endure, I didn't have the energy to initiate a divorce. A significant factor was that Jane's visits had almost ceased over the years. The turning point came this year. The in-laws decided to move from their longtime family home to a condominium. We plan to make it our final home. The view from the balcony is quite nice. George, more energetic than usual, spoke excitedly. I could empathize with their desire to leave a too large house for a more manageable lifestyle. Their move preparation was truly a massive undertaking. Their home was cluttered with belongings, requiring considerable downsizing to fit into the smaller apartment. Out-of-fashion clothes that no longer fit, countless paper bags. There were even unopened gifts. While gifts like towels could potentially be sold, expired food had to be discarded. For 2 people, the excessive amount of crockery was also likely too much. Jane, we can't keep everything. I understand your sentiment, but the new place is smaller than here, right? Most items that needed to be discarded belonged to her. Understandably, she was terribly resistant to my touching her possessions. Stop talking nonsense. Do you want my things that badly? How despicable. Holding onto what was essentially trash, she glared at me. I decided it was a losing battle to say anything more and shrugged it off, walking away. Finally, it was the day the in-laws moved. I hadn't yet been informed of the exact location of the new apartment. I wasn't very eager to know and planned to wait until they mentioned it. The moving truck was the smallest size, a light truck. Watching it, I worried whether it could carry all the belongings, and as expected, it was overloaded. Then, Brian began to hurriedly load our car with the overflow. Furthermore, as the in-laws got into the car, there was no room left for me. Standing there dumbfounded, Brian started the engine with a smug look. In a panic, I knocked on the car window. Honey. What's going on? Are you taking your parents? Should I just wait here? Then he cracked the window just enough to say. Just find your own way back. I'm going to live with my parents. Take some time off work for me.
Bye.
Stunned, I stood there as the rear car door opened. It was Jane getting out. With a triumphant look, she declared. Brian said he couldn't stand being scolded by his wife every day, so I decided to take him with me. Reflect on your own in loneliness. With that, she deliberately nudged my shoulder. Reluctantly, I had no choice but to ask. Please give me the address of your new home, in case something happens. We don't give our address to strangers. This time, I was truly speechless. Reaching my limit of endurance, I slumped my shoulders in defeat. I felt as if the dam holding back my patience had finally burst, letting all the pent-up frustration flow out. I thought to myself that today was the day of the last drop. Then, I'll divorce my kept man. I stated this calmly, but with a slight emphasis on a kept man, ensuring Jane heard it clearly. It seemed Jane standing in front of me heard me loud and clear. She glanced at Brian momentarily but soon regained her composure, glaring at me with disdain. George, who was inside the car, seemed not to have heard clearly and came out with a puzzled expression, asking, Huh? I decided to make it clear to him as well and reiterated firmly. I'm going to divorce Brian, who is a kept man. Please take care of him from now on. I won't bother with him anymore. Thank you for everything up to this point. As I politely said my farewells, the in-laws laughed, their chuckles lost in the engine's noise. Sleep talk in your dreams, stupid. It seemed neither of them grasped the seriousness of the situation yet. Leaning on the open window, Brian looked up at me with a smirk. How can he be a kept man when he's working? You won't be able to live without him. George's frown seemed pitiful. Thinking to myself that it's your son who won't be able to live, I tilted my head. You do know my income, right? To this, he shook his head. In front of my astonished self, Jane shouted in frustration. You're cheeky for someone living off your parents' allowance. It was then that I finally realized. My in-laws truly knew nothing about our financial situation. At least, I had told her when I first took on my current job. Did she forget because it was so long ago, or did she never intend to understand? Either way, I never imagined they hadn't been listening to such an extent. But by now, that seemed like a trivial matter. Understood, I'll start divorce proceedings. I said this feeling oddly refreshed. I had lost the will to explain. Once I had made up my mind, strangely, I felt no more turmoil. He urged his parents into the car. Then, with a short honk of the horn, they drove away. I just silently watched them go. Returning home by taxi, I immediately went to pick up papers and started filling them out. Not knowing the current address wasn't an issue. I could use George's name and their old address for mailing. If they had filed a change of address, the mail would be forwarded to their new residence. Given Jane's subscription to several mail-order supplements, it should be fine. I chose to send the papers with proof of delivery and mailed it off. A few days later, I got a phone call. I thought it might be Brian, but it wasn't. It was George. Hello? The divorce papers arrived, but is this for real? This is too much for just a spiteful act. I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh, thinking they still considered it a mere spiteful act at this point. I had thought he was reasonable, but perhaps he's just another member of that family, including Brian and Jane. Of course, I'm serious. Don't worry about my livelihood. I am, after all, a company executive, so I do have an income. I responded firmly. He seemed a bit bewildered and muttered. A woman being a company executive, is that even possible? It seemed he still doubted me. I remembered mentioning before that I was the executive vice president of our small company, but how had he taken that? There's also the possibility he never really listened. Or maybe, given his significant hearing loss, he misunderstood. There are female executives in other companies too. But it's fine if you don't believe me, I've reached my limit of endurance. I've had enough. I answered dispassionately, without the energy to explain further. I was just too tired. Then, he grunted lowly. I see, understood. Then I won't say anything. Sorry for all the trouble you've been through. I was pleased to sense a genuine note of regret in his strained voice. It seemed he was the only slightly sensible person after all. Relieved, I politely said, thank you too, and hung up the phone. Half a day after the call from George. My phone rang while I was out, and I saw it was Brian calling. Taking the opportunity, I turned on the recording and started the conversation. Hey, this is terrible, suddenly demanding a divorce. Sending this to me, I'll sue you. You better change your mind, or it won't end well for you. What a fortunate person, to say such things after he himself had initiated the separation. Moreover, since he declared me a stranger and left without giving an address, it's only natural for me to consider divorce. His insistence on playing the victim was infuriating. The main reason would be your repeated emotional abuse, I suppose. It's sad that the diaries I've kept since I was young will serve as evidence. Your decision to leave on your own will likely be seen as your fault in this case. My lawyer, Daniel, says so. While I explained, he interjected with dismissive sounds like, huh, and what? His attitude was so dismissive it made me doubt he was listening, but when I mentioned the lawyer, he suddenly became flustered. A lawyer? You can't be serious. His voice trembled with panic. I had my phone on speaker mode while talking. This was so the person in front of me could also hear. Smiling and nodding at the person in front of me, I responded with conviction. Of course, I'm serious. We're consulting right now. Let's avoid direct discussions going forward and go through Daniel. Before I could finish, Brian cut me off, shouting. No way, I won't agree to a divorce. What about my job? It'll make things uncomfortable. Let's meet and talk. I'll come to the house right away. Please listen to me. I let out a wry smile as I faintly heard Jane's voice in the background, urging, just get a divorce. The person in front of me, Daniel, whom I was consulting, seemed amused. As I was pondering what to do, Daniel quickly wrote a note and showed it to me. It suggested inviting him to the office. Following that advice, I instructed Brian. I'm not at home right now, I'm at Daniel's office. If you insist, come here. After giving him the office address, he assured me he would come and hung up. Sipping coffee provided by the office staff, I waited for his arrival. I wonder if he'll really come. He's such a coward, he might just run away scared. While I mused, he soon arrived. I was prepared for a face-to-face meeting with him, with the lawyer present, but to my surprise, he wasn't alone. His parents were with him. I could tell that he must have said something like, I can't do this alone, come with me, asking his parents to accompany him. I was astounded by his lack of independence. He entered the office looking tense. He seemed restless, glancing around nervously. Daniel sat next to me, ready to face the three of them. Now, the direct confrontation was about to begin. Wait, no, I mean, divorce, that's just unthinkable. Facing me across the table, Brian immediately started speaking in a hushed, rapid voice. Despite his shouting over the phone, he could only mutter in the presence of others. I firmly rejected his plea. No, I absolutely want a divorce. I never want to live with you again. Since we're with a legal expert. Let's also discuss the division of property now. Brian flinched. He glanced at Daniel and then fell silent. It's pathetic how he could be so domineering with me or female employees, yet so meek in front of a male lawyer. I sighed involuntarily. After that, he didn't say another word, and George just sat with his eyes closed, arms crossed. With no other choice, I looked at Jane, who glared at me without hiding her intense emotions. What property? I have no intention of sharing a single dollar with you. Saying this, she attempted to throw her freshly served hot coffee at me. The office staff quickly intervened to restrain her, narrowly avoiding a dangerous situation. In a divorce, the assets of our household should ideally be divided equally between me and Brian. This is because, legally, the income earned during the marriage is considered a joint effort by both spouses. However, the situation changes if both parties agree otherwise. Fine by me. Let's have no division of property then. I answered coolly. Incidentally, I was the main earner, and the bank accounts, including those with substantial savings, were in my name. Even the car that Brian had been proudly using, as if it were his own, was registered under my name. His bank account, left at our house, contained barely less than $20, considering it was just before payday. Effectively, he had almost no assets. No division of property essentially meant that I would keep everything. Despite the dire situation, Brian remained silent, merely fidgeting. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, as if speaking to a child. At that moment, the silent George opened his eyes and whispered something stern to Brian. "Tell the truth." Yet he remained indecisive. Was all he said before. Incredibly, he laid his head on his mother's lap. While stroking his head gently, Jane kept glaring at me. I truly understood what it meant to be appalled. It was genuinely disturbing. Eventually, it was decided that the divorce would proceed without any division of property. As they were leaving, George made eye contact with me and bid a meaningful goodbye. Watching their departure, I reflected that he might not have been on my side but wasn't exactly an enemy either. He held the old-fashioned belief that men are superior to women, but he could admit his mistakes. After my in-laws and husband left, I finally allowed myself a smile. Daniel, who had been unusually quiet, seemed to have been biting his cheek the whole time, holding back laughter. It's understandable, given that the opponent who should have been arguing for a share had voluntarily renounced any claim. After the discussion, I hurriedly proceeded the divorce process. I was free. But it wasn't over yet. The following week after the meeting, Brian, now my ex-husband, boldly showed up at my workplace. It would have been fine if he just worked normally, but that was not the case. He completely ignored his own job and clung to me instead. "Olivia, I was wrong. I'll come home, let's get back together. I have my own job, and he and I have different responsibilities." It was extremely bothersome to have him following me around. Despite repeatedly telling him to return to his own post, he wouldn't listen. Instead, he jumped out in front of me inside the store and sprawled out on the floor. "Wha? Please." Seeing him cry out and flail his legs while drawing the attention of customers made me dizzy. This was truly unbearable. I decided to fire him. Everyone, including my brother, agreed to it. In fact, there had been multiple complaints about his work attitude from other employees. It was only my indulgence that had kept him employed so far. Naturally, no one lamented his departure. The next day, our supermarket was in turmoil again. "My child was fired, you must have poisoned the company against him," shouted furious Jane as she stormed in. I had her taken to the break room in the back for the moment. At my brother's suggestion, we called Brian and also summoned George. With my brother and a few employees as witnesses, the final discussion began. First, I explained the disgraceful behavior from the day before. Then, I addressed the accusation Jane had made, saying, "You must have poisoned the company against him." I didn't poison anyone, I decided to fire him. His behavior was disruptive to business, it's impossible to keep employing him under these circumstances. Hearing my response, George seemed somewhat impressed and said, "You have the authority to do that?" Everyone from the supermarket side present nodded. Of course, Brian must have understood as well, he looked diminished, shoulders hunched. Only Jane seemed shocked. I calmly presented the facts. Of course, I do. I'm the assistant manager and the executive director. In our small company, most decisions are made directly by my brother, President Parker, and me. Executive director? Jane finally seemed to grasp my position and turned pale. She grabbed Brian's arm, trying to make him look up. Ignoring them, George continued to ask questions. So, you were the higher earner? I slowly nodded. Yes, Brian only worked part-time twice a week. He couldn't possibly match my salary as an executive. It's not even 1/10, it's closer to 100th. And you said my job was due to parental connections. But Brian was hired entirely through my connections. It was a mistake, and this outcome is actually more appropriate. This time, Jane was truly speechless. By this point, it should be clear who was supporting the household without even thinking about it. The fact that she didn't know was surprising, but it was no longer important. It's just revenge, mixing personal issues with business. Brian exclaimed. It's about time he moved on and looked for another job. Wanting to work here under these circumstances is just too brazen. The issue is your bad behavior. We've had complaints from other employees, remember? Sleeping in the break room during work hours. Inappropriate remarks to female employees. You know this because I've scolded you each time, right? Oh. You ran away with your parents because it was too hard to be scolded by me? My voice unintentionally became stern. He started to cry with a deep groan. My son would never do such things. I presented evidence in front of the screaming Jane. There were multiple records of misconduct, including surveillance camera footage and recordings made by other employees. I'd even like to dock my own pay for having protected such a person in the past. Jane was stunned. When she reached out to Brian, I thought she was going to comfort him again, but instead, she pinched his ear with incredible force. What are you doing? Brian screamed and covered his head. Her fury didn't stop there. She began hitting him with a cushion she had grabbed, over and over. Having no other choice, I turned to George, the only one still calmly sitting and looking our way. I secretly helped out by working alongside the part-timers to make up for his lack of work. I've apologized to those who were inconvenienced and sent them gifts. It was all my selfishness. I'm sorry for the trouble caused to the other employees, and I'm relieved that we could finally fire him. Jane was sobbing with frustration. Jane, with a grave expression, apologized to all of us employees. Let's go home. Olivia, I'll have a stern word with Brian. I promise we won't trouble you again. Thank you for everything. With that, George stood up to leave. Being old-fashioned, he's likely to keep his promise. I felt I could genuinely believe his words. Hearing this, Brian looked as if it was the end of the world for him. Jane, gritting her teeth in frustration, then angrily rasped. Why would you say such a thing? That's a huge loss. We need to reconcile for Brian's sake. It seemed she finally understood the reality of her son. Now, she appeared not to want to let me go, contrary to before. Indeed, without me, Brian's life would nearly be over. But that's exactly what I wish for, and I have no intention of helping him. Just as I was about to retort, a thunderous voice echoed through the building. Enough is enough. George was furious. His eyebrows furrowed, he stood tall and imposing. Even Jane couldn't say anything back, just opening and closing her mouth and looking down. Brian, feeling the full brunt of his biological father's anger, shrunk back in fear. She may be your daughter-in-law, but she's someone we took from another family. In the end, she's a stranger. Don't even think about mooching off her. Aren't you ashamed? And today, it's clear you have been a huge nuisance. Brian, apologize. I was taken aback by his intensity. I had never expected such fierceness from usually quiet George. Maybe I didn't know my in-laws as well as I thought. In the end, Brian, shielded by his mother, didn't apologize and fled home. Only George turned back at the end to apologize deeply once more. Thank you, George. Take care, and stay healthy. I returned the farewell and watched him leave. I decided to forgive just him. Let's get back to work, shall we? At my command, the supermarket returned to normal. The rest of the story follows later. Afterward, my in-laws were left to manage on their pensions while dealing with an unemployed son in his 50s. I happened to see Jane in town, looking defeated and much diminished. Rumor has it that Brian is practically a shut-in and utterly useless. I haven't seen him since then. The following part of the story was relayed to me by my daughter. About 3 years after the divorce, there was a funeral for George. As his granddaughter, she attended the funeral. Apparently, it was sudden, with no preparations made in advance. They couldn't even gather enough money for a proper funeral, so it was a very simple ceremony. Now, Jane and Brian were left to live together, far from leading a smooth life. Without the tidy-loving George around anymore, the house they moved to quickly turned into a cluttered mess. They've become quite the neighborhood nuisance, I hear. Moreover, perhaps due to the reduction in pension after George's passing, they have been pestering people for money and have become quite unpopular. It seems they're really struggling, but it's nothing but a nuisance to others. I imagined the future loneliness and hardship that awaited them, but I couldn't bring myself to feel any sympathy. Instead, I felt a sense of relief as if a long-held frustration was finally clearing. Years have passed since then, and I'm now enjoying living alone in a lovely apartment. I never knew how wonderful it could be to have free time all to myself. Inviting friends for dinner parties has become my greatest joy. My daughter and her husband also look out for me. Speaking of which, my daughter, who never liked her grandmother, plans to cut off all contact with her. That's for the best. Especially now that you're pregnant, it's better to stay away from anything that could stress you out. There's no need for your baby to meet her. When I said this, my daughter, caressing her slightly growing belly, nodded in agreement. I'm about to become a grandmother. Of course, I want to do everything I can to help my daughter and her husband. However, I also want to be careful not to intrude too much on the young couple's life. As I approach my 60s, I find myself among friends who have chosen to remain single or have been widowed. Lately, we've been discussing the possibility of living together in a shared house filled with single ladies in the future. This time, instead of bottling things up, I dream of a life where I can discuss anything with my companions. Surrounded by so much happiness, I'm sure I'll continue to have the best days ahead.